There's no heartbeat. Those are the words that have reverberated around my life for the past 22 years. And although in the moment that the lady said those words to me, I didn't quite understand what she meant, I also immediately knew what she was communicating to me. And what she was telling me was that the future that I'd imagined was no longer happening. That moment was one that showed me the power of communication and how it can change your entire world. Because in that day, my world was turned upside down. The child that I was carrying to term, that wasn't happening. It was also that moment that showed me in hindsight that though those words were delivered with compassion and dignity and sensitivity, it didn't change what was happening because some conversations are just tough. And what I want to talk about today is some of the tough conversations that I think we need to have and what needs to change about the way that we're having them. In that moment when those words were said to me, I also reflected on the past few weeks. Was there something I could have said differently? Could I have said something that would have changed something? If I was angrier, more aggressive, would that have been better or worse for me? I was young, teenage, black. I don't know what could have changed in those moments. But in hindsight, 22 years on, and in the years that followed, when I've looked back on that, it helped me to understand the power of advocacy and how you can advocate for yourself in different moments when you think that situations could go a way that you don't want them to. Communication has always been interesting to me, and the art of it. If you can imagine the scene in the 1990s, I'm a young, curious, very mouthy girl, loves reading anything from the Reader's Digest to the newspaper to Enid Blyton to books about Malcolm X, extremely eclectic tastes. But how I would spend my school holidays was sitting outside my dad's study, listening to all of his phone conversations. Now, my dad was a minister in a church, and if you've been part of a church or any other small community, you'll know how political those places are. And I would sit outside my dad's study, pretending to read my book, and I would be listening to how my dad was maneuvering people. Those days, it was a phone, so he'd get on the phone to one person, move them on a bit, get on the phone to the next person, move them on a bit, get on the phone to the first person, move them on a little bit more. And it taught me something about communication and the art of persuasion, and how you can actually change people's minds, how you can take them from one place to another. And that made me really curious about, well, what can I do with my communication? But because I was 10, I wasn't thinking about it exactly in that way. But in hindsight, that's definitely how I've reflected on it. Now let's fast forward to our post-Brexit, post-Trump era, where you can see the opposite of that communication. Yes, it can be persuasive, but it's not about bringing people together. It's not about sensitivity. It's not about dignity. It's the very opposite of that. It's disagreeable, it's divisive, and it's often disrespectful. And it's not making any of us or our world safer. I think, in fact, it's making it a more dangerous place. And that's because some politicians, some media outlets, some thought leaders, some celebrities are turning the temperature up and up and up and up on the debate. And one of the questions I often ask myself is, when are we who swim in this societal water going to realize how hot it's getting? What is the point where we're going to say, it's too hot now, we need to change? I believe that moment is now. When we think about what social media adds to this, we can really begin to see, I don't know how many of you see on your feeds, all of those conversations that are just so awful. People saying the worst things to each other, the worst parts of humanity. But I know that there are the best parts of humanity, and there are people who do want change and who do want to change the way we communicate. But what do we need to change to stop this path that we're on and to get on a new path? I think we can look back, as I've looked back, on the different moments of communication that changed my life or changed an outlook, And I think we can look back at that Brexit moment when those conversations really started to get heated. Look forward and say, is this who we want to be? And if we carry on like this, who will we be? So number one thing I think we need to do to begin to change this path we're on is to communicate a generous and positive vision of the future. I think, first of all, I train senior leaders, and one of the things that I talk to them about when they're planning their presentations is sometimes they say, we need to do this, or we need to do that, and I say, if you change the word need and made it into, if we did this, look what could happen, people buy into your vision. They want to come with you. So I think we need to find a way to communicate a positive future that people and young people want to buy into, a world they want to be in. There are lots of things to feel hopeless about, and we communicate about them all the time. But why don't we communicate about who we could be? And I think we need to understand more about how we communicate. When I wrote about communication and social justice, a lot of that book actually focused on how do I understand more about how I communicate, about my style of communication, about what I'm trying to achieve, and how I bring people into that with me. I think often we tell people how wrong they are and how they could be better and how they think the wrong things and they say the wrong things, but we don't help them to see how they could be. We chastise them for what they're not. And I think there's got to be a better way to have these conversations. One of the things I think about for the future for these conversations is they have to be complex and nuanced. We need to stop having these unedifying, unfruitful conversations. You see those headlines about white working class boys are being left behind because they're helping young black boys. These are two groups of people who need very specific help. Why can't we have a complex conversation about how we help them in specific ways so that everyone has a chance to have more and be more? How do we begin to actually communicate to solutions? That we have to hold space for people who think differently. Sometimes because we disagree with people so strongly, we almost don't have the conversation at all. We just have an argument, and no one ever wins an argument. So how do we hold space and disagree with respect for those who are different from us? I always think about working in a newsroom, as I did for 15 years, and I remember how sometimes there's people in the newsroom who really don't get along with each other. But at 6 o'clock, the news is coming on, and the programme better get going. So that disagreement never got in the way of the news coming on air. Have you ever seen the news not come on because two people having a row in the back? It doesn't happen. So it's about thinking, how do we lean into that there's a solution, there's a future that we want, and we're willing to disagree respectfully on the how we get there to make sure we do get there. And we need to communicate in a world that considers people who are not like us, who don't look like us, who don't sound like us. Lately, a lot of the conversation has become about the other. It's them over there. But how can we think about a world that talks about us, not just them and us? Now, I'm not so naive to think that every conversation can save the world or that the world can be saved by every conversation. I don't think we're all going to sit down and start singing Kumbaya and then we're all just going to get along. I actually think it's going to be difficult because some conversations, as that conversation 22 years ago, are just tough. But that doesn't mean that you can't have them. So how do we get better at these conversations? Well, one of the first things I think we have to do is understand how we communicate. I've been thinking about this a lot and doing a few presentations, and I got it down to kind of 3 types of people, especially in the social justice spaces, and how they communicate. There's the antagonists, the educators, and the resolutionists. And I think one of the big problems about why we don't communicate to solution is because sometimes it's not that we don't want the same thing, it's that we don't know how we're going to get there with the person in front of us. Antagonists are very passionate people, often very emotional. They say the things that some of us are like, ooh, they went there, but they go there. They keep things on the agenda. They don't let things drop. And they're a vital part of the conversation. And then we have our educators. They tend to be more conciliatory. Well, if you think about this, and if you think about that, and if you see it from this side, and there's this historical context, and here's what you might not know. And they're people who like to bring the sides together, have a good old discussion. And then we have the resolutionists. Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. tend to be a bit low emotion, very rational, not always leaning into what the emotion of the other person has. And when you think about these three ways of being, many of us will have been those ways in a conversation that we're very passionate about, and sometimes a conversation that we're not passionate about. So how do we cross those divides? Well, the first thing is to understand it. I'm having a really tough conversation about something I am so passionate about, and I'm hitting an emotional wall. Maybe they're just someone who wants to know what to do and how to do it, and they just want you to tell them. Or maybe with the antagonists, we need them in the room or else the conversation would never actually start. And so it's about understanding how we communicate and how we're going to get someone over the line. It's about not just arguing about the problems, but actually getting around the solution. We can have very circular conversations where I'm right, you're wrong, and what I'm going to do in this conversation is tell you how wrong you are and make you see things my way. And that doesn't work. You don't often change someone's worldview in a 30-minute conversation. And as Dale Carnegie says, no one ever wins an argument. We also need to spot the blind spots in our own justice journey. Sometimes we can get very self-righteous as if we're on the side of the angels, but we all have justice journeys to go on. And it's about understanding in that moment when we're asking and inviting someone to see something differently, that we're also open and curious to seeing something differently, understanding why they think that way. Because unless you understand why someone believes what they believe, you don't have any hope of ever changing their mind and helping them to think differently. It's about recognizing that not everyone's going to be as passionate about your special cause as you are. And I think that's something that sometimes frustrates people. This is so important. It's the most important thing to you. And sometimes that's actually quite hard to take, that people won't see it that way. But it's about understanding that everyone has their passionate thing, and it's to invite people into the vision of the future rather than berate them for not caring. Because sometimes it's that people do care, just not as deeply. And also be curious about what you might not know when you enter these conversations. I always think when we talk to people, we talk to their now. We talk to that tip of the iceberg that we can see. But underneath that, there's all of these things that shape who they are, their past, their parents, their gender, their class, the media they consume, the TV programs they watch, the friends they have. Be curious about that person. I always say human beings are very leaky, so they know when you don't like them or they know when you're berating them. No matter how you dress it up with nice words, communication is more than words, but words also hold immense power. And it's that power that I think we all need to lean into because we all have it. And I think in a year where there's many elections happening, there's many headlines out there, there's many thoughts out there, my urge to everyone is when you're giving that soundbite, when you're writing that newspaper headline, when you're trying to canvass that vote, when you're trying to get more clicks on Instagram or any other social platform that you're on, what are you communicating? Are the words you're saying bringing people together? Is it making this world better? Is it making us safer? Is it bringing us closer together? Or are you dividing people? Are you being divisive? Are you being disrespectful? Because it serves you in that moment. Because the thing about communication, it reverberates on through time. And when I think about that moment 22 years ago and how it's affected me in the days, weeks, months, and years ever since, I understand the power of words and the power of how communication can change things, can change people, can move people. But I think we're moving in the wrong direction. And I just think it's going to take more of us to stand up and actually say, we don't want to read those kind of headlines. We don't want to vote for people who divide us. We don't want to follow people because they're famous when actually they're not doing us all good. And also for each of us to reflect on our own words and our own communication. Are the words we're putting out into the world creating a better future for everyone? And are they creating a better future for ourselves? Thank you.